Well, good to have you back now. We've had my next guest on a number of times because it's a conversation that we wrestle with a little bit. Convention of States. Do you support it? Do you think it's a good idea? My next guest, Mark Meckler, is the president and co-founder of the Convention of States Action, the largest nationwide movement seeking to call the first ever Article 5 Convention of States. And Mark, as I always do, first of all, thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
The next thing I always do is, okay, what is an Article 5 Convention of States? For anybody who hasn't heard and understands, let's just educate, shall we?
Yeah, so Article 5 of the Constitution contains the two ways that we can amend the Constitution. The first is when two-thirds of of both houses of Congress want to propose an amendment, they can do so, and then that goes out to the states for ratification by 38 states, three-quarters of the states. The second way is when two-thirds of the states believe that we need something to rein in the federal government, they can propose gathering in a convention, what we call an Article 5 amending convention, to propose amendments, which again go out to the states for ratification by three-quarters of states. And so what we're doing is we're pursuing that second method because DC is definitely out of control. We need to rein them in. It would take 34 states to call a convention, and then anything that comes out of convention would again require ratification by three-quarters of the states.
So, for example, when somebody comes along and says, listen, I don't want a Article 5 convention because they'll get rid of the Second Amendment. Of course, that wouldn't happen because you would never get three-quarters of the states to agree to such a thing. You wouldn't get rid of free speech. You wouldn't have a lot of changes. But what you might end up with is some fiscal restraint. You might end up with term limits, right? These are some things that could happen because I think term limits, although I've been standoffish with the idea most of my adult life, I'm warm to it some, and I think that maybe three-quarters of the states, 38 states, might say, you know what, term limits for members of Congress, the United States Senate, even the Supreme Court, might be a good idea, right?
Yeah, I think you could definitely get term limits. 85% of the American public support that. That goes across party lines. And I think it's important that we say not just term limits for Congress, but staffers and bureaucrats. Now, what I would call the Fauci Amendment. We never want to see another Anthony Fauci in the federal government. So, and I think if you're going to limit the terms of Congress, you need to limit the staffers and bureaucrats so as not to empower them. And I agree, possibly term limits for the Supreme Court and federal judges. Also, you mentioned something like a balanced budget amendment, fiscal restraints on the federal government. And then finally, Stephen, I think this is the most important, probably fits your philosophy as well, which is scope and jurisdiction restraints on the federal government. In other words, telling them things like you can't have a Department of Education or Energy or Health and Human Services. These are things that were never intended for the federal government. They belong to the people and the states, and they need to return solely to the people and the states.
Need to return to federalism, is what you're saying, Mark.
Exactly.
Return the states to where they belong. Now, to be clear again, in order to get an Article 5 Convention of States for a constitutional convention, you need 38 states to say yes. Is there a time frame for that? I mean, I know there's a time frame because the Equal Rights Amendment, which Joe Biden tried to declare the law of the land erroneously here a few months ago, did not get done in the time allotted. What is the time allotted? How does it work? Please explain.
Yeah, so there would be two different potential timeframes that we're discussing. One is how long does it take you to actually call the Convention of States? And for that, there is no time frame. As long as it takes to get to that two-thirds requirement, the 34 states is as long as it takes. The second is if amendments come out of convention, how long do you have to ratify them? And the convention itself could potentially impose those time restraints. I imagine they would. The Equal Rights Amendment that you discussed had a 7-year time frame on it. It came out of Congress with that limitation, and they didn't make it within that time frame. So I think those are the two different time frames. One is to call convention, no time frame. And the second is what time frame is put on the ratification of the amendment process. Also important to note, Steve, in history, it's been 18 months roughly to ratify any amendment.
Okay, so rule of thumb, 18 months, give or take. Now, you do have some allies inside the Beltway now. You have some allies inside this administration. Does that change the math?
Yeah, I think it does. And obviously, we couldn't have planned this, but we have Vice President J.D. Vance as a supporter, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, Caroline Leavitt is a supporter, Mike Huckabee is a supporter. So we have administration support all across sort of the highest levels of the administration. I have spoken to President Trump about it. That was probably 5 years ago. He has not expressed public support, but he seemed supportive when we chatted. So I do think it changes things. And I think right now we are pursuing President Trump's support. We actually have a petition online at conventionofstates.com/Trump, which is an open letter to Donald Trump. If Trump weighs in, I think that absolutely flips the balance. And I think we see a convention of states called pretty rapidly.
All right. So we got about a minute and a half here, Mark. Two things. If you could get two things done in the convention of states and they got ratified by 38 states, what would the two biggest things be to you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first would be a limitation on what's called the Commerce Clause that says the states have the right, or the federal government has the right to regulate commerce between the states. And that's been broadened out to cover virtually everything: education, energy, healthcare. We need to limit that back to what it was originally intended to cover, which is shipment of goods across state lines. That would get rid of about 40 to 50% of the federal government would just go away overnight, or I'm sure it'd be grandfathered in it, but it would be impossible for them to regulate virtually everything. And the second, if I could get it, I don't know that we can, would be the repeal of the 17th Amendment,
Absolutely.
which is the direct election of senators.
Yeah, that's the best thing I've heard all day. That gives me hope in the world because if it were done the way the Constitution called for, we'd have about 56 Republican senators right now. That's a fact. Maybe more. And we wouldn't have had all of this nonsense and leftist-leaning garbage. I think those are two excellent points. Repair the Commerce Clause, which, right, has been used as the shield to create all sorts of government that it was never intended. And the 17th Amendment, the worst amendment of the United States Constitution, 1913 is when that went through, for those of you keeping score at home. Mark Meckler. Good work. I wish you well. Of course, you'll let us know here on the program if something moves, if the needle moves. We look forward to it, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. God bless.
There he is. If you want to find out more, go to the Convention of States Action. You'll learn more. How do you feel about it? Follow me on Facebook and drop me a comment. We'll find out. I'll be back.